Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for having me on here. It's been very interesting listening to some of the information that's come out about hydrology and water quality and those sort of things. And I missed the beginning of Rebecca's. I'd have dropped out here. Hopefully it won't happen again. But talking from a farmer's point of view, it's, I've worked a lot with people like Rebecca and that in trying to learn about what we did wrong and how we can try and improve them. This photograph here is where I grew up. It's Jingle Money. The Shoalhaven River's at the bottom of that slide. And why I put that up is the title of my talk's about water in the landscape. And if you look at this profile of the soil, you can see that there's a vast capacity for the land to hold water. And it was one of the big insights that I've learned over the years is how we tend to look at water, what we see, and not what's actually in the landscape. This erosion gully, this bit that I'm standing in right there, was started by my father. So there were boggy areas there, and if you look down through that profile, you can see those black layers. They're the boggy meadow sections of the landscape. And then the big rocky bit about at my chest height there was probably the last ice age when large amounts of rock were washed off the Gurrock Range, which is behind the camera. This erosion gully had got to 20 metres deep, yes, 60 feet of topsoil that had been drained. And if you think of it, the water profile could be in that 60 feet of water. And once we've cut through it, we're actually draining the water out of the landscape. That's the bad stuff. The good stuff is the solutions. This is Jillamatong, where I am now. And in this photograph, you can see the erosion gully now is filled up with water. So that erosion gully went the full length of the farm, 2 kilometres. And I was, in 2005, able to meet Peter Andrews, and he showed me where to put, or taught me where to put chains of ponds back into the landscape and create a chain of ponds again instead of a drainage system. The interesting thing to look at this photograph is those farm dams are still very turbid. This photograph was taken in 2014, and up underneath Mount Jillamatong there you can see there's a big dramatic change in colour of the pasture. If you look on the left-hand side, there's my mob of cattle. There's probably 300 or 400 head of cattle in that paddock at the time. And the red grass on the other side is kangaroo grass. So I've been able to manage my pasture by using grazing management. This is looking down the farm. Now, the first thing to note is that the erosion gully is a straight line. And we know nature doesn't go in straight lines. So when we look at a landscape and we start seeing straight lines, we go, okay, so man's gone in there and altered it. This system used to be a step diffusion system where the water passed from one level to the next. And normally at those junctions, there was the chain of ponds. Peter Andrews was able to show me where those junctions were. And the pond there in the middle where you can see the 2 contour lines running out from it, that's where the first pond, Peter said, put one in here and you'll never run out of water. So you can see these ponds now. They're getting bigger and bigger as we go down, but you can also see how the boggy meadows were eroding out from the erosion gully and taking away all my fertility. And the big thing that I've learned is that when you put those plugs back in the landscape, you then allow the water to go back into the landscape, but you also stop the fertility leaching away. When we had the system, as you saw in that first photograph, where we have got a big erosion gully, not only is the water running into that erosion gully and out, but the fertility's being leached down. So then we had to put on more superphosphate, we had to put in pastures, and there was a lot of expenses in doing those sort of things. The pH of our soils, as a result of the fertility and the grazing management and the leaching, dropped dramatically. And when I took over Jillamatong, the pH had dropped to 4.3 average across the farm. So here's looking above. You can see at the bottom of that, the last weir there is the last legal weir I can put in the erosion gully according to the Office of Water at the time. And you can still see it's draining in that section below that. There's an interesting thing on the side there. The contour bank on the left-hand side was put in by my grandparents back in the 1970s, 80s to stop the erosion that was eating into the landscape. And that contour bank was still draining, and it went around into that square dam, and then the water was put into the drainage channel again. Back then, we still had a drainage mentality, and that's been the big insight I've gained from working with Peter Andrews. But I should start off by saying that the thing that helped me the most change in the farming practices was doing holistic management with Alan Savory. And his practices are more about changing the way we make decisions. So in the past, my goal was to run as many cattle as possible, to cut as much wool as possible, to get crops, bales of hay, or whatever. Then when I thought about it, I'm actually in the process of harvesting sunlight and turning that into a product that then I can take off the farm in the form of crops, wool, beef, lamb. When you've got that changed way of thinking, then you start thinking about how I can best capture sunlight and produce the most beef, which is what I'm mainly doing now. In doing that, I've had to learn about pasture, the species. Back in the good old days, I sprayed most of those paddocks you can see in the photograph and used to kill everything and plant a few species, generally 3 species: phalaris, ryegrass, fescue, maybe cocksfoot later, a couple of clovers. Since I stopped spraying nearly 20 years or 30 years ago, we have been able to improve our pasture species, improve our water holding capacity of the soil, and dramatically improve the production off the farm and increase our profitability. That was the changing factor for me, was to learn. A friend of mine who I used to do contract spraying for rang up and asked me the questions of how long does it take, or how much does it cost to spray out a pasture, how much does it cost to re-sow a pasture, which back then was $240 a hectare. And then he asked me the question, how long does it take to get your money back? And, first he asked the question, how long does it last? And with our set stocking system, it was 5 to 7 years. And then the next question was, how long does it take to get our money back? And that was 12 years. That's not a good scenario if you're a farmer. Basically, we were all slowly going broke. And so that led us to changing. And I've ended up now on a lot more exciting trajectory of learning from initially Alan Savory, and then a lot of the Elan Inghams, Christine Jones, Nicole Masters, who are talking about soil biology. And then I've been involved with many other groups. So you can see here, one of the first, this was a big dam I put in before I met Peter Andrews. And it actually shows how the boggy meadow was eroding back in all sorts of directions. Unfortunately, I don't have we didn't take photographs of when the thing looked really degraded. There were no trees left on the landscape either. The entire braidwood granites was down to, I think, 4 or 5% trees left. We were very good at killing trees, in the early days. The interesting thing with this photograph, though, is the farm dam on the bottom corner there, and how brown and turbid, as we were just told about in the last talk. Turbidity was something that all our waterways were, all our dams were. What I've done is measured the temperature of the weirs that are in the old erosion gully and the dam on the same day. The weirs were 18 degrees and a very even temperature from top to bottom, because we've got lots of water plants growing in there and it's a clear body of water. That farm dam with the turbidity there was very hot in the top bit, 28 degrees, and then 15 degrees underneath, and no oxygen. So the fish and yabbies I had in there were dying, and the water was evaporating much quicker. It was interesting, one of the other talkers earlier was talking about ribbon weed, and the fascinating thing that we call all water plants weeds. There's various water weeds, but we don't actually name them. It's a ribbon weed or that. But those water plants play a large role in reducing the evaporation from the ponds. Yeah, it just blows me away. In 2019, when the fires were coming onto us, those weirs all had water, and my farm dams, I've got 42 of them, were nearly all bone dry. And that's because they were turbid. The top bit gets very hot, evaporation increases, there's very few trees around them, there's no plants in there, etc. And they're not connected to the landscape. So this is a video, but just remember this dam that we're going to look at is that same muddy dam we just saw in that previous photograph.
Oh no, the sound's not working, sorry.
Okay, I can talk over it. So what the person was saying in the sound was that there's 170 odd cows in this paddock. They've been in there for a few days, and yes, they do plop on the ground and they pug around the water. But if you've got it well designed, you can have clear water, healthy water, and what I've found is that the cattle then don't go into the water and don't do any damage to the water. Now, this is taken just 2 days ago, and you can see the water is very clear. It did shock me with Cougar's photographs of the Yass weir there. It didn't look like turbidity. It looked like liquid mud going over the dam wall with the Yass River there. Since we put the weirs, which incidentally got 14 weirs going down the erosion gully on Jillamatong, which goes for 2 kilometres. Back when I built them in 2007, it cost $14,000. So an average of $1,000 a weir. Some were 500, some were 2,000 or 3,000. The cost of them is very inexpensive if you can use the soil in the area. We've now planted, so this farm dam, remember it was that muddy one in that previous photograph. After the 2019, when all the dams went dry, we went in with an excavator and we built a little moat at the top of the dam, and that's to catch the initial water that flows off the landscape, and that moat then can hold that fertility, because what normally happens on farm dams is they silt up over the years, and then every 10 years or so we have to desilt them. By having these moats here, I hope never to have to desilt a dam, and in that the water that's now flowing in gets filtered and stays clean. The stock then don't seem to want to walk into the dams to drink. They just go to the edge, have a drink, and then they go away and have their rumination away from the dam and generally don't do damage. This I know is controversial because a lot of people feel that waterways should be fenced off from stock, but part of our process is to move the stock on a regular basis. At the moment, because it's so wet and puggy, we're moving them nearly daily. Sometimes they could stay in a paddock for a week or so. A final thing to note here, that's nardoo that's growing on the water there, which is a native water plant. The drops of water on the top probably were rainfall, but the big thing I've noticed since we maintain a good grass cover is that we get a huge amount of dew, and often in the morning when I go out, there's droplets like sitting on the nardoo there on all my grass. When I was at university, we were taught that stomata in plants expired water. We were not taught that they could actually take water in. Since working with Christine Jones and Nicole Masters and that, we've learnt now that huge volumes of water can be absorbed through the plants and taken down and fed off back into the soil. And we've done cuts into the soil in dry times and found that the grass around the root base was wet, and that was water that was being brought in through the dew. And we're feeling that could be, that dew that's being harvested every day could be adding up from 1 to 2 mils per day. So when I'm managing the farm now, I could be getting 200 to 300 mils more than my neighbours. This photograph here shows the fires, 29th of November 2019, coming straight towards me. It was not a nice feeling. It was quite a big thundering fireball. And you'll notice that I've got quite a good ground cover there. The tree lane on the right-hand side of the photograph's got a fairly good ground cover in there. The lower down, this was, you can see a bit of the haze in the background. This was during the fires. My weirs were still full of water. So you can imagine if the Australian landscape was still functioning as it should have in those forests off to the west of me, we wouldn't have had that fire racing through. There would have been boggy meadows interspersed in the valleys. So you can see the weir had hardly dropped. Unfortunately, 42 of my dams were dry at that time. The next photograph shows the Shoalhaven River in November 2019 as the fires were coming. In fact, there's smokes in the background there. It had been dry, bone dry for a month. Braidwood was trucking water in, and as the fires were coming, they were struggling to find water to put out the fires. In fact, the helicopters ended up coming and getting water out of my weirs at one stage every 40 seconds, which protected a lot of the houses around Braidwood. We're only 2 kilometres from the town, and so it was a great asset to have the weirs there. And some of those big weirs that you saw in the earlier photographs can be holding up to 4 or 5 megalitres of water. They dropped at the most 0.5 metre to 1 metre. The reason they were full was not because of the water stored in the dam, and I was pleased, it was mentioned earlier that dams are not very good at storing water in droughts. It's because they're connected to that huge sponge that we saw in the first photograph, and the water is 90% of my weirs, the water is in the landscape, but it can seep back in as it runs out. During these fires, my system was still trickling out 20,000 litres of water a day into the Shoalhaven. Unfortunately, it was drying up before it got to. This photograph here shows where they pump water for the Braidwood water supply. This is just over my boundary fence the next day after fires came through. Whew, gets a bit emotional. Yes, the landscape got totally destroyed, and yeah, it's pretty sad to see a farm get burnt like that. I wasn't expecting that. So this is Jillamatong today. The hill in the background got totally burnt in 2019 that day, but it recovered very quickly. And the reason why it recovered very quickly was not just because we had the water in the landscape, it's because we built up our soil carbon levels greatly. I didn't get any weeds coming back, which was fascinating. We did drill in a huge amount of biodiverse pasture mixes, including a lot of summer active things. Had sunflowers, daikon radish, and all sorts of things grew up straight after fires. In fact, they were all going to seed within 3 months of the fires. My pastures have recovered, the water's recovered, the water's clear. You saw those photographs of the Nadu there. And in the entire floods that we've had since the fires, no water has left Jillamatong turbid. The Shoalhaven, unfortunately, is now flooded 10 times. And that, to me, is very sad when you go down there and you see that turbidity, which is our asset, particularly from a farmer's point of view. It's his fertility, it's his asset that he intends to hand on to next generations, going out to sea and creating problems in polluting from the Great Barrier Reef all the way down to here. So I'd like to conclude by saying that, yes, in the past, farmers, as a 5th generation farmer in this district, we need to put up our hand, and all those trees you see in the background, apart from the poplars that my grandmother planted, I've planted in the last 30 years. I wish I'd planted more. The system we had come up with was a drainage mentality. And by understanding how the Australian landscape worked with slowing water down and processing fertility and storing that fertility and water in the landscape, basically by using plants. From learning from that, I've found that we can actually increase our productivity, increase our water holding capacity, decrease the effect of fires. There were parts just over where that photograph of the devastation over my fence, there was a part there that was covered in poplars. Funnily enough, they were planted for matchsticks, but somehow they gave off enough humidity or moisture that they didn't burn, and they put the fire out around them. The fireys at the time came to me and were just dumbfounded at why the fire didn't get in there. It was dead grass underneath, dead poatussock, dead serrated tussock. Leaves had been falling down for months as the trees were struggling, but somehow those water-based trees put out the fire in that zone. There was no firefighters in there that night. So the water in the landscape is the secret. I'm thinking that that's come to the end of that, and I'd like to open for any questions.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's been a really interesting journey that you've helped take us on. I think it certainly demonstrates to me, I think farmers are really at the front line of the extremes in our climate, and we've certainly experienced that over the last few years. And been really great to hear some of your experiences and insights and what you've learnt over that time. A question from me, I'm interested, sort of what are your next steps around Jillamatong? Obviously, you've done a lot in the past. What's the future look like for you and the farm?
Good question, Andrew. Building biodiversity. So before, when I used to kill everything and plant 3 or 5 species, I didn't realise the damage that did, and the lack of resilience you have in your landscape when you've only got 5 species. Now we've got 80 species. There was an amazing, that post that I was standing, or that I took the photograph next to as the fire was coming. 2 days after the fire, or maybe a week after the fire, a green planter emerged there, middle of the drought, fire just gone through, and this plant came up. I don't know what it was a native form, but it grew. We had funguses and bacteria coming up that apparently only come after fire. There was this orange fungus that came across the ground. I'm now learning that there are millions of different, well, not millions, but I was on a Zoom meeting last week with a farmer in America where he's got 2,000 species on his farm. So I've got to 80. I've got a long way to go in building biodiversity. And why is that important? We now know that different species have got different root patterns, different depths they go to. We did some core sampling with Soils for Life a year ago, and my roots are now down at least 1.5 meters, where we got down to 1.2 meters in the core sampling. So if you've got roots down there, Christine Jones has taught us that plants give off exudates and pump soil carbon into the soil. So building soil carbon, building biodiversity, building my capacity to hold water in the landscape. And then how do you do that? There's a lot of groups out there now that are educating. I was pleased to hear early this morning the use of Aboriginal artists. Maxine mentioned there's a fantastic group out there called Earth Canvas that is joining together with regenerative farmers and artists, so that the artist can teach the farmer about patterns in the landscape. And once you start to see the patterns, you can see how you can work with the land and improve it. That's poetry, art, and those things are the forms that help people change their thinking. I'm thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really wonderful, Martin. It certainly links back to some of Maxine's words earlier around the importance of these connections. I think the more we can make these connections across, the more powerful the learning is, I think. And that's I think that's a wonderful example of that.
And observations. I had a great learning experience with a wonderful Aboriginal man, Uncle Max, and he taught me to observe the landscape in time and space and make decisions on what you're seeing. And the particular question that brought this up was on willows in rivers. And I asked him, what did he think about willows? Now, instead of having an opinion, like most of us do, he looked at the landscape, he looked at the function those willows were doing, and he said, if you take that plant out, what's going to do the function? And he said, he actually closely looked at it and said, it's actually holding the water, it's holding fertility, it's allowing these native plants to grow up underneath it. And the best thing is there's a platypus underneath in the pond. So when a lot of people who were there at the time were saying, oh, these willows poison the water, create erosion, and all the arguments we have against willows, Uncle Max looked at them and he said, the platypus is saying it's okay. So not only did he observe that plant in its situation, but he also observed the structure of the pond, the platypus being the top order predator. And if it's there, then it means that all the rest of the pond is functioning. Brilliant.
Well, Martin, it's been really interesting to hear your story. I noticed Claire shared the Soils for Life link to your story there as well. Encourage people to go there too.
Earth Canvas, better do a plug for them.
Yeah, if we've got an Earth Canvas link, we can share that in the chat as well. So that's all we've got time for the moment. But we do have the panel discussion, and you've raised a lot of really interesting topics here, Martin. So I'm sure there's plenty of things we can explore further on.